For those of you joining us for the first time, this series has been a response to what has been happening at Penn and other universities this year. It is an effort to learn more about this moment as part of a larger relationship between Jews and the university in America that has developed over the last century. For the last two sessions, we've been focused on the history of that relationship, including the history of anti-Jewish discrimination in American academia. And one takeaway from the previous two talks, I think, is that there are aspects of that history that are still coming to light. With today's presentation, however, we turn to the present situation here at Penn and other campuses, and our focus is on one of the most difficult issues that universities have been struggling with over the course of the last year. Basically, how to balance between a commitment to academic freedom and opposition to hate speech. I thought it would be helpful to read to you the university's official position on academic freedom as expressed in its policy on open expression. I quote, "The University of Pennsylvania, as a community of scholars, affirms, supports, and cherishes the concepts of freedom of thought, inquiry, speech, and lawful assembly. The freedom to experiment, to present and examine alternative data and theories, the freedom to hear, express, and debate various views, and the freedom to voice criticism of existing practices and values are fundamental rights that must be upheld and practiced by the university in a free society." Now, this commitment at Penn is longstanding, and many, in fact, would argue that it is the key to the greatness of the American university in general. But as I know many of you have learned this last year, the events of recent times have put academic freedom under a lot of stress, and universities have been subjected to a lot of criticism for how they have interpreted academic freedom. Does academic freedom apply even in cases where it allows hostile, incendiary, prejudiced, or harassing speech, or where it is used to legitimize violence? Does it make a difference when speech is online, anonymous, spoken from behind a mask, or involves doxing? How does one draw the line between legitimate criticism of Israel and speech that demonizes or dehumanizes people for who they are or what they believe, and is trying to control or suppress certain kinds of speech, an acceptable or workable solution? And how does one draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable speech when language is so often ambiguous? These questions have always been difficult for universities, and they've never felt more volatile or consequential than they do right now. We're not going to resolve all these questions within a one-hour webinar, but to help us think about them more deeply, I've turned to a colleague here at Penn, a philosopher of education who has focused a lot of her scholarly work on the university as a democratic institution. Professor Sigal Ben-Porath is the MRMJJ Presidential Professor in Penn's Graduate School of Education. She has played many different advisory roles at the university, including a role in the president's office, an advisory role for Penn Press, the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, and she now serves as the director of the Paideia program, whose mission is to support more robust civic dialogue on campus. Among her many publications, the ones that feel most relevant to our presentation today are her works Citizenship Under Fire, Democratic Education in Times of Conflict, Free Speech on Campus, and Cancel Wars from the University of Chicago Press in 2022. I wanted to turn to her in this moment because she has thought so deeply about academic freedom, both in theory and as it applies very locally here at Penn. And I'm very grateful to her that she's willing to share some of her insights with her today. I will note before I welcome her to the stage that if you wish to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, our Director of Public Programs, Ann Albert, will appear on screen and ask some of the questions on your behalf. So without further ado, Professor Ben-Porath.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to the CAT Center. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. It feels like home turf. I was a fellow at the CAT Center last year. It was a very fulfilling experience, and during that time, I wrote a piece that focused on anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the boundaries of speech about Jews, particularly on college campuses. And so my plan today is to revisit some of the same topic in light of the October 7th massacre and the ensuing war, focusing on the implications of this terrible series of geopolitical events on American college campuses. And as I hope you realize, I'm going to go into some difficult topics. So take a deep breath and try to work with me through that. I traveled to Israel back in October and again in December, and I'm going back next week for spring break. And whenever I'm there, many people ask me about the struggles on campus here. It is front page news for weeks on end. And in fact, I have some friends and colleagues from Israel on Zoom today, as well as I think my parents. Shalom, Erev Tov, welcome. Still, every time I make the trip from Israel back here, I'm struck by some of the debates on this distant campus that the war has certainly not touched directly. Sometimes the privilege of the unaffected is jarring to me, going from a region in active war with all its profound mourning and fear to what sometimes feels, at least in part, like performative expressions of pre-existing ideologies lacking in nuance. I just feel so strongly how low the stakes are for many campus activists and how high the stakes are for everyone in the region. We need nuance, we need ideas, we all need support, listening, empathy, and we get so little of those. But I regularly advocate for engaging in passionate political debate. So here is my assessment of this one. And as you will see, my thoughts are still forming and evolving. And so I'll speak for a little bit, and then I definitely look forward to questions and discussions and disagreement. So what I want to talk about is as follows. First, I observe a shift in the rhetoric and expression about the conflict, about Israel, about Jews, and about various related topics. The rhetoric has been escalating for a long time, but since October 7th, it has further become extreme. First in celebrating the massacre, and then in criticizing Israel's harsh response. And second, beyond this shift, I note a shift in attention and response to speech, protest, classroom discourse, and research about these issues. The attention and responses by the public, by the media, by Jewish members of campus and other people, by donors and trustees, have been both more critical, stronger, and more emotional. And I want to offer some thoughts about these responses, and then also to suggest some ways for our campus and other campuses and the various constituencies on campus to address the current mess that we are in. So first of all, the shift in rhetoric in recent years, and especially since October 7th. The massacre on October 7th sparked a heated debate on many campuses. Much of that played out in public, culminating here at Penn with the president's resignation. I note one aspect of this debate that was new, at least to me, both on campus and on social media. Some colleagues and students expressed support for the massacre. This remains the most perplexing and painful aspect of the shift in rhetoric for me. I'm thinking about Bernard Williams' observation. I quote him, "It could be a feature of a man's moral outlook that he regarded certain courses of action as unthinkable." It was startling and depressing for me to find out that this was not the case for some people I know. And I regularly try to remind myself that this is true of merely a handful of people and that many of them are likely speaking from ignorance. More on that below. Since the war in Gaza began, louder and more pointed critiques of Israel and its policies and actions towards Palestinians has been voiced on campus, along with support for political visions such as Palestinian statehood. Many of these are legitimate political views, though some can be interpreted and are interpreted by some people as calling for the eradication of Israel. The chants and calls have been with us for a long time, but they've been more frequent and louder in the fall, and for many of us, they have taken a new and menacing meaning, especially because of the celebration of the massacre that I mentioned. In addition, in protests and marches by the pro-Palestinian side, we are seeing efforts to single out Jewish business owners and public figures and call for condemnation of them or boycotting their businesses, sometimes damaging their businesses, based on perceived or actual support that they have voiced for Israel. And that's true both about Jews and about people from Israel like myself. This is not entirely new, but seems to have increased since the fall and continues to ebb and flow. And along with these changes, we see a clear rise in reported interpersonal incidents, such as anti-Semitic and aggressive comments and behaviors directed towards Jews, particularly Jewish students. And these are shifts from the world as we knew it until October 6th. Many of these forms of expression, political, hate-based, and the gray area in between them, existed then, but are now more frequent and more extreme. These responses seem to build on views circulated through academic domains of study, which I want to briefly touch on. Their most problematic aspect is the singling out of Israel as a uniquely evil country, which is portrayed as alone among the nations whose birth is in sin, invalidates its claim for land or the right to existence or to defend itself, and whose erasure, Israel's erasure, would serve as the only remedy for those injustices. Consider, for example, the case of ethnic studies. In 2020, California state law mandated ethnic studies for undergraduate in the UC system and in a different section in high schools. And the field of study was defined as such. Ethnic studies, I quote, is the interdisciplinary and comparative study of race, with a special focus on Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latino Americans. Some studies in Arizona in the past have shown a positive impact on engagement and graduation that might result from incorporating this area of learning into the high school curriculum, as was the effort here. At some point between 2020, when this definition was crafted, and now, as my colleague Hollis Robbins documented recently, the scholars charged with creating and incorporating ethnic studies courses into high schools across California, an effort that is now delayed, have redefined the field of ethnic studies as follows: a field that, and I quote, analyzes, confronts, and intellectually dismantles historical and institutional forms of racism, apartheid, settler colonialism, and empire in and beyond the United States. So it's a very different definition. And oftentimes a sole contemporary example used to illustrate this type of generalized injustice that the ethnic studies program aims to intellectually dismantle is Israel. Only Israel. Jewish support for Israel and other Jewish organizing in the United States is sometimes wrapped up in the same framework through broad repudiation of Zionism. Any distinctions between Jews, Israel, different policies and voices within our communities, both that of Jews and that of Israelis, and historical narratives are elided. Any careful discussion about legacies of empire, forms of settler colonialism, other contexts in which they are still in operation, intersectional views are all pushed aside for static framing of the conflict in Israel-Palestine as a matter of white colonizing oppressors and non-white indigenous oppressed populations. These simplified visions of settler colonialism and oppression focus on a flattened view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a topic whose connection to the domains of study in which it is circulating is unclear. The heightened or singular focus on Israel and Jews in programs that are not initially set up to study those issues, like Middle Eastern studies or other, for perceived or real violations of justice is concerning, right? So the singling out of the region. And the implied or voiced suggestion that if only Israel or Jews or Israelis were eradicated from the map, the problem of settler colonialism or related forms of injustice would go away is so similar to historic anti-Semitic views that they are practically indistinguishable. And sometimes it just sounds too similar to the role that Jews play in the white nationalist replacement theory conspiracy, but this comparison is beyond what I can get into right now. There is a growing debate about the relevance and the validity of the ways in which the settler colonial or oppression frameworks are being used in various disciplines today, as well as on their lack of normative import in their specific anti-Semitic usages. Part of the problem is that this framework of analysis that has been and can be used productively is currently deployed not as a historic analytic tool, but as a condemnation, framed by the assumption that one can easily distinguish white Europeans from indigenous people as the only two possible options in the Middle East, and that the consequence of this partly inaccurate and partly simplified version of Jewish history and Palestinian history in Israel is that the state should cease to exist. I'm not sure that this framework can, I am sure, in fact, that this framework can reemerge from its current mimified form. But I'm putting this suggestion aside, and I hope that those who are actual experts in this area can and want to pick it up. And I know that many of them are doing so as we speak. Let me reiterate. Zionism is a political stance that recognizes Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Opposing Zionism can be a reasonable political stance. But using the term Zionism in the catch-all way it is currently used in some of these discussions is hateful rather than political. And associating being Jewish or being the wrong kind of Jew with a particular political stance is an anti-Semitic position. As Ken Stern correctly argued, the question of the relations between Zionism and Judaism is an internal community issue that is a very live debate in our communities. And for others to make demands and assumptions about this relationship is not appropriate. It leads to statements like the following made last week by SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, and I quote, "It should be clear, just as Israel, in quotation mark, has no right to exist, Zionism has no right to be on campus." So that's not an appropriate position in my view. Similar struggles over Zionism, its moral and political meaning, and its expression on college campuses were seen prior to October 7th, and maybe people can recall what happened at Berkeley Law last fall, the previous fall, right, 2022. But again, their tenor and their pace have escalated since October. Such, for example, was the case of a Chicano studies class at San Diego State University, where the instructor chose to start this term, the spring, with a lecture about colonialism and apartheid in Israel, which was both uninformed and entirely unrelated to the class material. Or consider, for example, the recent struggle at Barnard over the landing page of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. The program posted a pro-Palestinian statement on the front page. The administration at Barnard took it down, and the free speech tussle ensued. Who owns the front page? Who gets to speak through it? For whom do they speak? The program faculty, all of them, did they vote for that? Do they speak for the college? Do they speak for the student body? So this is familiar territory, right? These are issues I've dealt with for years in the discussions of free speech on campus. But here is a new twist based on the notion that support for Palestinian causes is, so it is suggested, part of the mission of the Gender and Sexuality program. And look, there are definitely gendered aspects to the occupation, to the conflict, to the war. I'm not disputing that. But to suggest that if you are interested in studying women, gender, and sexuality in New York City, if you're interested in that, you have to care about this particular sliver of land and its struggles, and that you have to take a particular side in the conflict. That if you are a student of gender at Barnard in New York, that is a questionable statement to me. I don't think the two things are or should be related. To research the gender dimension of the occupation or the Israeli-Palestinian region, for sure, you can write about it. I mean, people do that. It's, it's protected by academic freedom, as you just heard from the quote in the opening comments from Stephen. But for a department to endorse this perspective at the top of its main page stands a different message. This message both excludes those who disagree and aims to indoctrinate those who happen to be interested in matters of women, gender, and sexuality without giving a thought to this particular conflict. Those who come for studying gender and end up endorsing an uninformed or flattened perspective on Israel-Palestine deserve our attention. They learn ideology and political views rather than disciplinary methodological approaches. They get a limited and often anti-Semitic, or at least significantly uninformed about Jewish matters, understanding of a complex issue, one that does not belong at the center of their work. And some of them end up endorsing a prepackaged set of slogans instead of learning to think. To be clear, I share many of the concerns raised about the war, the Israeli government, the occupation, etc. Although I would hope that I have a nuanced view of the realities there. My critique here is not about the specific arguments about the war or Israeli policies. I'll talk about that in a moment if I have time, but about the ways and the domains in which they are raised and circulated. I understand the spread of these concerns and the focus on Israel in unexpected quarters I understand it as a consequence of current American political polarization, where increasingly, to prove your bona fides as a proper progressive, you have to align with the Palestinian cause, and your alignment with the Palestinian cause necessitates vitriol towards Israel, towards Zionism, and sometimes towards unsuspecting Jews. Like other polarizing ideologies, these claims demand ideological uniformity. They purport to demonstrate a vision of justice that is devoid of evidence or compassion and is thus neither academically sound nor morally justified. Since October 7th, it has become clear that not only is the shift in rhetoric accelerating, it cannot be ignored. The meager academic foundation on which it is built merits critical attention. It deserves attention because it grounds some of the ludicrous arguments that are circulating about October 7th, about the conflict, and about the region and its history. I heard people make these arguments in the past, but I saw them as localized, small, not worthy of much attention, and I no longer see them in this light. So this is the shift or the change in attention in responses to this rhetoric. And again, many scholars, I mentioned Ken Stern again, and he's going to visit our campus later in March, devoted decades to considering them, right? And we are seeing pushback from various members of our different constituencies in regards to things like the cartoons produced by an adjunct lecturer at the Annenberg School for Communication, a person who taught here for a long time, drew these cartoons for a long time, but now is garnering more attention. So we are seeing a shift in the attention, both within and beyond campus. More students are interested in that, sometimes to learn about it, sometimes to protest about it. Politicians are paying more attention. There's another congressional hearing on Thursday that Penn is involved in. Parents, donors, trustees, right? So we see a lot of people who are worried, and I don't see all of their responses as grounded either in law or in an understanding of what a university is and should be. So I share the impetus, but I don't share all of the solutions that are being offered. So let me get now, that's the last part of my talk, to what should be done. I'm starting with some things that should not be done. So first of all, I'm putting aside everything that's already illegal. Harassment is already illegal, attacks on people, vandalism, all of that is beyond my topic here because, you know, that's a business for law enforcement. What we remain is with the question what to do about anti-Semitic speech that is protected by academic freedom and by law, potentially by academic freedom and definitely by law, including the First Amendment, which, as you may know, protects hate speech. What to do about these offensive forms of expressions and demands that most university in light of the demands that most university policies, definitely the policies around speech, remained content neutral. What do we do about that? We cannot single out legally, and I don't think legit, otherwise either. We should not single out anti-Semitic speech as a particular form of expression that needs to be curtailed. So I want to clearly differentiate my recommended responses from some of the suggestions promoted by others who raise similar concerns. I don't think censorship is the answer because of speech laws and academic freedom rules and practices, which are central to the functioning of the university. I don't think undue pressure from outside forces will do the work here, because universities cannot do their work without appropriate levels of autonomy. And I've argued extensively about that in the past, and I continue to believe that we need to solve our own problems. I don't think many of the laws that are being circulated now, the discriminatory concepts laws, like in Kentucky, or the divisive concepts laws in about a dozen states, they're not going to help here because they are censorial and they don't fit the university's mission. As my friend Adam Hussein recently argued, and I quote, "If we don't resort to censorship, we need to think more about the responsibilities of all actors involved with this particular form of difficult speech." And he's thinking about similar areas as we are today. This suggests an important role for colleges helping students exercise these responsibilities rather than simply trying to control them through speech code. So if we cannot censor and we cannot enforce intellectual diversity, as some of these laws are trying to do, and we cannot punish our way out of it, even though I think that there are some appropriate processes that would limit hateful, persistent, and targeted speech in some cases, especially in class. What are some things that we can do? And I want to focus on just two constituencies. I want to talk about what university leaders can do, and I want to talk briefly about what scholars can do. And other groups like students and parents and trustees, I'm happy to talk about if you're interested. So for university leadership, I want to offer one key suggestion: to make fewer statements and to offer more guidance. Declaring the university's views can be helpful when it reflects clear values that can guide action. But an ongoing stream of statements and restatements offers little information and guidance and creates both confusion and anger. Why did you talk about this and not about that? I don't subscribe to the current popular demand in some quarters for institutional neutrality. Many free speech scholars demand institutional neutrality, that leaders don't say anything. In my view, education is never neutral, and pretending to be neutral is often a cop-out rather than a stance. But I think we do need to be far more judicious in our leadership statements. Statements need to come from the lowest and most relevant entities on campus, and they need to come few and far between. Although when asked at a public forum whether calling for genocide is permissible, moral clarity would be helpful. Not that I think that anyone at Penn was calling for genocide. In light of the documented rising hate, universities can consider new rules, or in some cases, they need to clarify existing rules and make them more concrete. But they should do so with caution. Many new rules are just going to create new pushback, as Brandeis saw when they banned Students for Justice in Palestine, or similar at Columbia. It just drags you into court. It's a declarative statement that doesn't do much work for you, and the students reorganize in other groups. So not very effective. Changes have to maintain institutional autonomy and the school's value and mission, with a focus on responding to hate and emphasizing opposition to hate, especially identity-based hatred. In recent weeks, I want to offer as a positive example, the Vice Chancellor at the University of California system circulated a policy reminder to faculty, noting that the university may not function as an instrument for partisan interests. The UC Code of Conduct notes that it is unacceptable for faculty to conduct their courses in a manner that involves significant intrusion of material unrelated to the course. That's content neutral, and it's helpful. The Vice Chancellor reminded instructors in California of the importance of ensuring that students are not made to feel intimidated, threatened, threatened, or excluded in their classes. The Code of Conduct further prohibits canceling class sessions for the purpose of encouraging students to participate in a protest or rally. I think this is very important to clarify on all campuses. It's inappropriate to do that, as well as the misuse of the classroom by, for example, allowing it to be used for political indoctrination or for purposes other than those for which the course was constituted. So at Penn, as in most universities, speech protections are limited by time, place, and manner, which is the court's language for the permissibility of protecting the core functions of the university. So in other words, the courts demand that the institution protect speech, but they permit limitation that are content neutral and guided by considerations of time, place, and manner. So these examples from the University of California are helpful, and we can clarify our own guidance in light of our own guidelines on open expression. But clarifying rules is not enough. University leadership should communicate content expectations, both when those are enforced and when those are merely standards to consider. Are all chants and calls during protest acceptable? Is there anything that instructors cannot say in class? Anything that crosses the line of academic freedom protection? Some claim that academic freedom protections are unbound. In my view, they can legitimately be restricted by a number of guidelines that reflect the professional responsibilities on which academic freedom rests. Relevance is one line, as I just claimed. Lies is another that's very hard to draw, but I think is appropriate to consider. And as I just noted, including all students the line of including all students should not be crossed. So clarifying that here at Penn and in other institutions, including what to do about cases in which people transgress would be very helpful. So attending to policies, enforcing them, amending them as needed, recommitting to existing rules, rejecting hatred, whoever it is directed against. All of these are things that university leaders can do. My last point is about what scholars can do and how scholarship helps. And I think scholarship, first of all, scholars need to consider the singular focus that some people have on Israel and whether it can reasonably communicate or be seen as communicating hatred towards Jews or identity-based hatred. So I just think we need further reflection about the relationship between activist effort for justice, however one perceives justice, and teaching, right? Now, I recognize that the two are not always clearly distinguishable. I'm reflecting on my own practice, right? I care about democracy that lead me to march for democratic causes, both in Israel and in the US. It leads me to focus on democratic citizenship in my research, teaching, and leadership work. But still, I strive to maintain a distance between political partisan goals, for which I march in my life as a citizen, and the inclusive, open-minded, fact-based, and broad goals and views to which I introduce my students and which I entertain in my research. It is surely not perfect, but I make sure to include perspectives and voices of those who disagree with me in my classes and to entertain them in good faith in my work. This is a distinction that is important to sustain if a university work is to maintain its integrity and as higher education aims to defend itself in good faith from partisan attempts to undermine its legitimacy. So, we need to sustain the difference between, for the purpose of this discussion, criticizing the Israeli government, which is, of course, something that, you know, a lot of people do and reasonably do, in my view, criticizing its conduct during this war, and attempts to dismantle Israeli democracy, right? Attempts to delegitimize Israel or its existence. There is a difference between criticizing the occupation and justifying murder. I insist that the former is a legitimate political view and that the latter is illegitimate and immoral, even if it's protected by American law. Campuses do and should have ways to condemn such expression, to limit its reach, and to prioritize fact-based, disciplinarily sound, and morally grounded vision. And I just note people, like our colleague Jerry Jacobs in sociology and others who demonstrate how useful the disciplines are, disciplinary knowledge and disciplinary methodology, with the structures and analytic tools that it offers to address some of these concerns. Lastly, we can and should offer alternatives. We see both at the University of Michigan and at NYU, just in the last week, announced that they are starting centers for the study and prevention of anti-Semitism. 2 weeks ago or so, Ari Kelman in this series talked about whether, he suggested that classes may not be the right venue for educating students against anti-Semitism. He suggested residence halls as an alternative. I actually think it needs to happen in both places and other places. We need to offer various opportunities. Duke has a speaker series now about the Middle East. We need diverse scholarly opportunities for people to engage in well-grounded, fact-based, methodologically sound knowledge creation and dissemination. And this has to happen both within, but definitely also beyond our Judaic studies centers, the Jewish studies programs, or other dedicated spaces. Our core commitment as a university is and needs to remain tied to the effort to seek the truth and to educate all of our students in the values of a diverse democratic society. Not by proselytizing in the name of a political view that we already hold, but in cultivating and investigating and continuously being open to diverse perspectives. We should insist on including Jews in our ethnic and ideological diversity, in the structures and practices that are focused on belonging and inclusion. And we need to protect our institutions from undue outside pressures or any type of undue pressure, among other ways, by taking a clear stance against hatred and bigotry when it is cultivated within our institutions. We need to rely on robust analytic frameworks that are already available to us, on accepted evidentiary practices to provide alternatives to simplistic and sometimes bigoted thinking and teaching about Israel, about the conflict, and about Jews. And I look forward to engaging with you in conversation with Anne's support.
Thank you so much, Sigal. I'll just reintroduce myself quickly. I'm Anne Albert. I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Katz Center. Happy to help engage Professor Ben-Porath in some conversation. So we already have a number of questions. I do encourage people to put them in the Q&A, and I'll do the best I can. I want to start with a little bit of a broader question that people are asking about campus open expression policy, which you could talk about specifically at Penn, or about the idea of open expression policy as a thing on campuses. What is the goal of such policies? Is it primarily understood as being connected to the educational goals of a university, or is it primarily understood in connection to facilitating community or common humanity, or a certain kind of experience for students and participants in university life? How did these kinds of policies develop, and how have they evolved, and what's the purpose?
Great. So that's a very important question. And I would just say that the initial and foundational reason for supporting open expression, free speech on college campuses is distinct from that same effort in broader democracy. So in democracy, we support open expression, and we have laws and practices, et cetera, to sustain it, because we want to ensure and reflect our belief in the dignity of all people, right? So you and I have the same, and anyone else have the same right to express our views, even when we're wrong, even when we're hateful in the US, although in other countries it's more restricted, because we are members of a shared self-governing democratic society. On campus, it's different. The reason for maintaining open expression and defending it is so that we have the opportunity for open inquiry. So if we want to cultivate and produce knowledge, we want to push the boundaries of knowledge, we want to disseminate knowledge for the public good and for people's individual interests and goals, we need to be able to hear diverse views in order to do that, right? Because once we fall into a dogma, everyone thinks the same thing or has to subscribe to the same view, then we cannot move forward with our inquiry and with our work. And in my view, so what I said so far is like your garden variety sort of like reasoning. I want to add to that in my view, including all voices in the discussion is really foundational to maintaining open expression on college campuses, right? So if we can't hear diverse voices, if we can't listen to each other across difference, then we can't actually learn from each other, and our purpose of open inquiry is going to be restricted or undermined. So I really think inclusion is a form of cultivating open inquiry, right? I just see the two as sustaining each other. But generally, the goal is the goal of the university, producing knowledge and disseminating it to all of our members and for the public good.
So in a situation where like a university where you're saying the goal is even more active investigation and free exploration of different ideas, does that lead, do you think, to greater intervention, meaning, I suppose, restriction on what's possible, or does that lead to a necessity for less intervention and letting people do what they will do?
Right. So that's the big question, right? I mean, and it really goes along with the general question of whether a productive discussion needs any rules, right? So I would say it's not a question of more or less. It's a question of which rules are useful, which rules would enable us to have a productive, open-minded, dialogic, in my view, right, context for the discussion, right? How can we know if you and I are talking about the topic of shared interest? How do we know that we are not just falling into sort of like routinized thinking, something we read and we just stick with it? How do we know that we can keep investigating, right? The way to do it is really to have rules that would be both broad enough so that we can listen to each other and hopefully to a lot of other people, making sure that people know that they can share their views, because maybe there's someone else who has a different perspective, but they are restricted by something we said, or that they feel we won't welcome them, or we came up front and we said, well, look, this is a conversation, for example, only for women, others can participate. So some conversations are only for women, in my view, right? So that's or for only for whoever, right? I just said that about the conversation about Judaism and Zionism, right? I think it's an appropriate conversation within our community. So here is a rule for you, which I think is useful and productive. But there are going to be rules that are going to be overly restrictive, silencing, not letting us hear each other. So we have to be, my rule of thumb is, to what extent is your rule aligned with the goals of the conversation? What is the conversation for? Is it for you to tell me something that you already know and I should just learn? In which case, it would be a good role for me to shut up and for you to speak, and this way I can hear you and write down what you said. Right? What is the goal, and how are the rules aligned with that?
This sounds wonderful. And there are a lot of comments. Thank you for your clarity and for laying things out so thoughtfully. And there are also some comments saying, but what about when people break break these rules, right? So sadly, I think most people would agree that, at least in theory, being able to push up against the boundaries of open expression is important, and some kind of reaching some mutual understanding of which kinds of speech is perceived as hateful is definitely a goal. Sadly, it doesn't always happen, right? So one question that's been posted is, if you can offer some comments on what are appropriate consequences, or what should the university do, or any of its arms do, in response to speech or actions that have clearly crossed this line.
Great. Well, clearly crossed this line is the sticking point, right?
Or less clearly, let's say.
Right. So here is what I would say. As I noted, we need rules. We need some rules. This is not just it's not like the public park where, as long as you don't, I don't know, punch anyone, you can say whatever, or your family dinner. This is a purposeful discussion that we are having. And so when people break the rules, we need to see various things. We need to see, where did it happen? The class? Did it happen, in a public space at the university? Did it happen in the dorms? Each of these need a different set of rules because the goals are different. People live in the dorms. It makes sense to be more restrictive in terms of views that people may voice to you in your house, which is the dorms for students, right? So, but in class, we need more diverse views, but we have a concrete goal of learning, right? Something specific. So we can have a lot of perspectives, but we cannot have any topic. We need to stay on topic as best as we can, right? So anyways, so the context of where the speech happens really matters. And who it is who's speaking. I think, for example, students have more wiggle room. I don't know exactly how to put it, right? We need to recognize that students can be allowed to make mistakes. You know what I mean? It's part of how you grow and learn. As part of the way in which you engage civically is that you try this, you try that, you try to convince or mobilize people, you try to make a statement, you're gonna make mistakes. And so I think we need some space for mistakes as well. At the same time, if you have rules, you have consequences for breaking them. And I think that is permissible. And is already part of our handbooks and conduct rules, and it's already there. And I think, again, generally speaking, it's there in an appropriate way. There may be some aspects that need clarifying or specifying, but I do think that there is any range of consequences, the most unusual and extreme of which would be losing your membership in our community, meaning being expelled or fired, right? I think that is not off the table. Like, I can imagine things that people would do as students or as instructors that would merit that. But I think that has to remain very, very unusual. And we have to have due process before we get there for anyone, who broke a rule where this is on the table. But there is any number of other things that we can do before that. We can reprimand people, we can suspend people, we can mediate. That's the most common one at the university right now, is a mediation and restorative justice practices, right? So there are a lot of responses that we can offer, but the main thing is that we cannot adjudicate them like this. We cannot just say, oh, look, you did this, now this is what's going to happen, right? We have to look at who did what, where, right, to whom.
How do you manage, or how does the campus manage thinking about actions or speech that people carry out either outside of their official university roles or off campus, especially knowing that such a thing is extremely porous given the internet? You've spoken very beautifully about I think you just did, about the idea that faculty have a different kind of standard of responsibility in the way that they're behaving, because they're the educators, and the students have a little more grace to learn and make mistakes in some way. But of course, faculty also may be making personal statements or attending rallies in their own personal capacity and not as educators. So how do we even begin to approach that mess?
Right. I mean, that is surely very difficult. And I will just note that it is made difficult by the existence of the internet, as you note, social media platforms, etc. But it's also made difficult by the growing expectation that faculty, and to some extent, maybe even students, but definitely faculty, take a public stance about matters. And this is, I'm talking about the expectation that's coming from the university. Oh, public outreach, public intellectuals have to sort of like, disseminate their work more broadly to a wider audience. You need to speak to different communities, write op-eds, whatever, right? So the porous nature of our extramural speech is generated by, the internets, but it's also generated by the expectation from the university. And so, look, academic freedom protections in the United States, which again is distinct from many other democratic countries, protect 3 domains: research, teaching, and speech as a citizen, right? So if you are especially if you are a standing faculty, so there are some distinctions there about with different types of faculty, you're supposed to be protected in your speech as a citizen, right? Which means that you can say what you like and it's protected by academic freedom practices, as long as it doesn't pour back into your classroom. What you say in your classroom, that's a different thing, right? So that's over there, there is more responsibility expectations that are placed on you as an instructor, or me as an instructor, that is different from whatever I want to like shoot the breeze. I just want to say things. I want to shout into the void on the internet, or so, right? So the distinction remains, like what I say and do as a citizen is one thing, and it's more protected than what I say and do as a teacher, and again, distinctly what I say and do as a scholar or a researcher. So I think people, can make the distinction between sort of like the public-facing internet type talk that instructors and others do. You can choose to ignore what happens there. You can put it aside. You can assume that this is a persona that's different. And a lot of people cultivate these kind of online personas. That's over there. What happens in class is the person treating everyone appropriately in class. That's needs to be sustained as a separate question.
I want to ask you one more question in general about campus open expression, and then move a little bit to some of the Jewish specific issues that you started out with. And this is a question that I'll read out from an audience member. Forgive me if you don't want to answer directly, you can speak about the context. This person asks, what do you think the university presidents at the December congressional hearing could have said instead of what they did say about it depends on the context regarding a call for genocide? So,
okay, yeah, that's a fair question, right? And I want to just start off by saying this was a tripwire question. It was raised specifically for political reasons, right? It was trying to get them to trip, and they did, I think, anyway, I have other thoughts on why the question was raised and the whole context, but we don't have to go into all of that. I think once the question was raised, there were 2 points that needed to be made. One is that it doesn't seem that anyone here called for Jewish genocide, right? Which would have brought potentially the next question. I think this was like a prelude for the actual question. What about Intifada? What about this, right? So looking at specific chants or call river to the sea, etc. Like, is that legitimate? So trying to push sort of like in this direction. But the response that was offered was like, oh, we protect open expression so people can say whatever it is that they are saying, and it's going to depend on whether they act in illegal ways. Of course, the student conduct doesn't specify that you cannot call for Jewish genocide. The student conduct rules are content neutral, right? They cannot specify specific phrases or, perspectives for censorship. But I think what could have been said is nobody called for genocide. And if they were, we would find it morally abhorrent as something that we oppose, right? All of our mission is for educating people about humanity and its work and its equity and dignity. Of course, we are opposed to that, right? And specific questions about conduct are answered in the way that I just did in the previous question you raised, right? So where was it said? Who said it to whom, right? These are like adjudicating a specific case is different than saying generally, of course, calling for any type of violence and hatred goes against our mission.
Right. Okay, switching gears a little bit. You started out with some brief comments that have elicited a bunch of responses and questions about the differences between Zionism and anti-Semitism, or different forms of speech about Zionism that might be more or less appropriate or acceptable in a campus context. And so I first, because you moved through it sort of quickly, I wanted to invite you to just reiterate your understanding of when and how or in what form it's appropriate to either espouse pro-Zionist or anti-Zionist views in a campus context, and how you understand that in relation to anti-Semitism per se.
Great. So, I mean, I have 1 minute to resolve this. So here is me fixing the whole thing in 1 minute. Discussions about Zionism, as long as they are directed towards the way that I termed Zionism, which is the belief in the political belief in the continued existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, right? As long as we think about Zionism in this way, I think any perspective about it is fine, right? You can endorse it, you can reject it, you can have questions about it, its origins, etc. So any of this can work. And anti-Semitism, by contrast, is hatred toward Jews, right? So that's a distinct thing. The problem is that sometimes we use the term Zionism in a way that denotes, certain perspectives about Jews and their support for Israel, and therefore a wholesale rejection of Jews, or their, existence in the US or in Israel or anywhere. So the hatred part versus the political part is what we need to try and sustain as a distinction.
Thank you. I see that we are out of time. We could continue to ask you questions for another hour based on how many have been submitted, and I would love to, because this is very, very clear and helpful, and it's terrific to be able to think with you about what's going on at Penn and elsewhere. So I guess we'll have to encourage people to read what you've written and to connect with you in other formats. And I just want to thank you so much again, Sigal, for being with us and offering this. And thank everyone for coming, for submitting such terrific, thoughtful, deep questions on so many aspects of this issue. I will let you all know that the video of this program will be posted on the Cat Center's YouTube channel within a few days. And we do have one more talk in this series presented by Jerome Carabel about Jews and admission policies to elite institutions. So there were some questions about that in the Q&A just now, and I skipped over them because we have one final talk in the series about that. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again, Sigal.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was wonderful, and thank you to the CAT Center for hosting.